Welcome back for the second half of our discussion of the 1920s. In this portion of the lecture, I like to focus on Texas. We've already seen the general framework of the 1920s in the U.S. as a whole. Now we're going to look at a number of factors in Texas. The economy, with booming growth for some, with stagnation for others, and we'll look at some social issues, and then also the political situation in Texas. Well, you'll recall that the first major oil discovery in Texas was Spindletop, just east of Houston in Beaumont area, and subsequently in the 1920s, a significant amount of petroleum was found in West Texas. And this was really an oil boom. It led to huge growth. Around the oil fields, there weren't any real large towns or cities there before, and there were these camps and towns that grew up with many thousands of men in there. Well, not surprisingly, there was no effective law enforcement to keep people in control, and so there was a lot of violence. There were swindlers, there were con men who arrived trying to sell, leases to land they didn't own, etc., and lots of gambling and prostitution. And on several occasions, the state government sent the Texas Rangers in to suppress the violence and try and keep order in these camps. On the positive side, the discovery of oil in West Texas greatly aided higher education in public universities in Texas, because you'll recall the Permanent University Fund had been set up many decades before with huge areas of land in West Texas. And the income from that land, by law, had to go to both the University of Texas, which received 2/3 of the income, and Texas A&M University System, the remaining 1/3. Well, there really wasn't much income from those lands in West Texas. Previously, they had contracted out with farmers who could let their cattle graze on the land, but there wasn't that much income. Now, however, with massive oil finds, the state of Texas received a significant amount of revenue. And this greatly led to the expansion of both the University of Texas system and Texas A&M system. By 1928, Texas was the leading oil-producing state in the United States. And in fact, Texas alone produced about 1/5 or 20% of world oil production. And more broadly, now the Texas economy is being diversified away from agriculture and timber to include the petroleum sector. Well, the petroleum sector obviously includes more than just the oil wells pumping the oil out of the ground. There was an increased demand for steel, greatly increased demand for labor to work in the oil fields, and all the other business services such as banking and insurance. And in these new boom areas, housing had to be provided and stores for workers, and increasingly workers were taking their families. Well, by 1930, Texas had grown to the extent it ranked 5th in population in the United States, with 6 million residents. Houston was the largest city in the state with 3,000 residents. Dallas wasn't far behind with 260,000, and a close third was San Antonio at 230,000, and then Fort Worth with 160,000. Now, in terms of infrastructure in the state, both the federal and state governments provided funds for road construction, and about 20,000 miles of new roads were constructed in the state. By 1929, there was a car for every 4 Texans. Now, that included children, and obviously children weren't driving. So many people, middle class and above, had automobiles in this period of time. The early part of the decade was fabulous for the many cotton producers. The land under cotton cultivation increased significantly thanks to irrigation, and many former cattle pastures were converted into farms with irrigation. And this was particularly true in the northern part of the state, where there was a large aquifer not very deep underground, and you could simply pump the water up. And we saw in a previous lecture how many farmers built simple windmills, just using wind energy to pump up enough water for their cattle. In the southern part of the state, there was a great increase in the production of citrus fruits, such as oranges, lemons, and grapefruits. But on the negative side, across the state, the number of farmers in tenant or sharecropping arrangements greatly increased because farm ownership was consolidated into larger farms. By 1930, in fact, 61% of Texas farms, that's almost 2/3, were operated by tenants. And in contrast, in 1880, there had only been 38% of Texas farms were tenant farms. Unfortunately, after the early part of the 1920s, crop prices started falling, particularly for cotton, and that, coupled with the increased number of tenant farmers, left many Texas farmers struggling. So the decade of the 1920s can also be characterized as a decade of economic stagnation, or worse, for the farming industry. And this is not just in Texas, this is throughout the United States. Well, as a result, many farmers decided to leave agriculture, and they went to work in the oil fields, or they looked for opportunities in the cities. Now, in general, the blacks and the Mexican Americans benefited much less from the new economic opportunities that the whites were benefiting from. The blacks and Mexican Americans concentrated in manual labor and trades in cities, but those jobs were very low paying, or relatively low paying. There was also ethnic discrimination against Mexican Americans, and also religious discrimination in some cases because they were Catholics. And so as a result, while many whites were looking to get off the farm and find more productive jobs in the oil sector or the cities, a much higher percentage of the blacks and Mexican Americans stayed in agricultural jobs. Well, at the same time, you had continued segregation of the schools. There was a, quote, separate but equal decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1890s. And so the state of Texas and other southern states argued that they were complying by setting up separate but equal schools for both Mexican Americans and blacks. Unfortunately, they were not equal. There was unequal funding given to the black and Mexican American schools. And so the net result was these minorities had much less opportunity to receive education, and therefore that was another factor holding them back economically. Now, we saw in the earlier part of this lecture the jazz age in the cities, the large cities, the jazz music, the flappers dancing, just, what was viewed, though, by many Americans, most Americans, in fact, throughout the country, this was viewed as frivolous, and the flappers and others were viewed as cultural rebels, much the same way that the hippies were viewed in the 1960s. And many people said, well, the U.S. is just in turmoil. How can you have women out with short dresses, dresses that look like their nightgown, and dancing in public? And this produced a real conservative reaction. Again, not just in Texas, essentially throughout the country, outside of the major cities. And there was a reaction, of course, in the major cities too. And people across the U.S. said, well, much of this is probably due to having the various ethnicities in the cities. This was not so much in Texas, but in the northeastern part of the United States and the Midwestern part, many immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were coming in. And then others blamed it on, well, these, quote, foreign ideas like socialism, communism, and anarchism, which again was much more prevalent in some of the large cities in the northern part of the United States. And this conservative reaction was particularly strong in the rural areas, and including in Texas. And remember, compared to the North, Texas was still much more of a rural or small town state. And many people just became concerned about the general direction of the United States. Where was it going morally? I mean, is the country headed in the wrong direction? And in Texas itself, there were very few Texans who dressed as flappers or attended jazz music sessions in Texas itself. Some did, but it was generally outside of Texas. That said, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, many Texans were attending movies on a regular basis. There was no television. Often they would go to one or two movies on the weekend, perhaps a movie during the week if they were in a small town or a city. And on these movies, just the movies themselves had a really exaggerated portrayal of life in the United States. And it had lots of people, women dressed as flappers. It had gangsters. It just had a portrayal of the United States that many people found disturbing. We all know when we go to movies about the, taking place in the U.S., you normally are not going to watch a boring, today, middle-class suburban family, because frankly, who wants to go to a movie and watch that? That's pretty boring to watch. So we see, quote, action movies with police cars screaming through the cities of New York or Miami or something. And, if you were on Mars, the planet Mars, and you were just watching these movies, you would have, I think you'd agree, a very different conception of life in the United States than people like us who live here. So the movies were providing Texans and people throughout the U.S. with a very exaggerated view of the impact of these new lifestyles of the flappers and jazz and illegal drinking. Now, there were two major reactions at this period of time. One was called nativism. Now, this has nothing to do with the Native Americans or the indigenous people, but rather the white Protestants from old Europe, which was defined as the northern part of Europe. They felt that they were the real Americans, and they were very prejudiced against and somewhat afraid of the, quote, new immigrants coming from other parts of Europe. And this would mean the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews from Eastern Europe or Russia. They looked down upon them. In fact, some of them even claimed they were of another race, that the Italians were were not Caucasians, they were some other race, but there was this real prejudice against them. And there started to be had been more immigrants, of course, from China, and they were looked down upon in general also. That was coupled with what's called militant Protestantism. Here the word militant means very strident, very strict and strident. It doesn't have anything to do with the military per se. So these were Protestants who wanted to focus on traditional Christian morality. They opposed Catholics, they opposed Jews, they opposed people breaking the law to drink. And so these two coupled together, and many people would fall in both categories. Then following World War I, in which, of course, the United States joined the Allies in defeating the Germans, there was a lot of xenophobia in the United States. Xenophobia, if you're not familiar with the word, means fear or hatred of foreigners. The word phobia is a Greek word that means fear. So there was xenophobia. And one example was the state of Nebraska prohibited the teaching of foreign languages in schools. And one state legislator in Nebraska even said, quote, "The English language alone was good enough for Jesus Christ, and it's good enough for the people of Nebraska." Now, if you're wondering why he said that, this Nebraska legislator read the Bible in English. And he just mistakenly assumed that the Bible had always been written in English and that Jesus Christ and everyone in the Bible spoke English. Obviously, that's not true. It's laughable. But this was the attitude. And as I mentioned, in the U.S. as a whole, there were many more immigrants since the 1880s, 1890s, who'd come in from South and Eastern Europe. These would be Italians, Russians, Greeks, Poles. And there were about 150,000 Mexicans who've come in the U.S. Many of those went to Texas and other southwestern states. And it reached the point in the 1990s, over half of the white men in the factories and the mines were immigrants who were born in another country. And unfortunately, a small number of immigrants from Europe were very proud of being violent socialists and anarchists. Anarchists are people who oppose any form of government. And they very proudly and openly used violence for political goals. Some of them were arrested, and they were very proud and made statements to the newspapers and in the courtroom that they thought that violence was the only way to achieve their goals. And this violence took the place of bombs in banks, not at 3 a.m, but during the day or right outside the bank, designed to kill or injure as many people as possible. Well, as a result, on a national level, in 1924, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924. And this was an attempt to reduce the number of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And it did this in sort of a clever way. It just didn't say immigrants couldn't come from, Italy or Greece or Poland or Russia. It said the number of immigrants were looked at by country, and it was 2% of the number of people from that country already in the United States in 1890. So what this basically meant is very, very few people from Southern or Eastern Germany would be allowed in. This is a political cartoon from the time. The caption says, "The only way to handle it." That's Uncle Sam. And there you have a funnel, and it shows all the many Europeans who want to come in the U.S. and Uncle Sam is putting filters in at various percentage points. Just quickly, let's look at immigration to the U.S. from countries outside of Europe. In the Immigration Act of 1924 also totally banned or prohibited any immigrants coming from Japan or China. And the Chinese had already been excluded from for about 40 years, but now they were totally excluded. But it's interesting that the Immigration Act of 1924 allowed immigration from the Western Hemisphere. And so the fastest growing ethnic minority in the United States, not surprisingly, consisted of Mexicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans, and other Latin Americans, from the Dominican Republic in particular, went to New York City. And it's very interesting also that the Hispanics who came into the United States were, while they did face some discrimination, it was generally much more socially acceptable to have Hispanic immigrants. Many married Anglos, and in fact, you may have seen the old 1950s TV show I Love Lucy with Lucille Ball. There are reruns available. Some of my students say they love it. And it takes place in New York City, and Lucille Ball is an Anglo with bright red hair and sort of crazy lady. And in the TV show, which reflects her actual life, she's married to a Cuban by the name of Ricky Ricardo, and this is true to life. And Ricky Ricardo was actually a famous band leader in Havana, Cuba, and many Americans knew him because wealthy Americans in the winter would not always go to Florida. They would go from New York, they'd go down to where? They go to Havana, Cuba, where there was a lot of gambling, nightclubs. And so he's in the TV show, and he has a foreign accent, and he sometimes gets the words mixed up. And some of the comedy revolves around Lucy making fun of his accent, but it's done in sort of a good-natured way. In contrast, this is the early 1950s here. It was about 30 years later, late 1970s, 1980s, before a similar show in the United States, a comedy or situation comedy, included a black person. Now, all these national debates about political radicalism with socialists and anarchists coming in, the influence of Charles Darwin and, evolution, as well as the immigration from China and Eastern Europe, while these issues really didn't affect the state of Mexico that much, Texans knew about them, and it just generally increased their anxiety about the fate of their country, and they looked at Texas and said, the fate of Texas. So there was this general cultural anxiety about where is our country and our state going. Now, in Texas itself, the black culture became much more prominent. It was easier to see music and whatnot, and there was a greatly increased number of Mexicans and other Hispanics in the state, and that caused a good number of Anglo or white Texans to sort of question the racial future of the state and the cultural future of the state. So there was a lot of unease and anxiety about where the state is going, and in 1 minute we'll see that reflected in the phenomenal membership of the Ku Klux Klan in the state of Texas. Now let's just look at a few numbers. The Texas census looked at residents and looked at their descent. So Hispanics were people of Mexican descent, whether they were born in Texas or foreign born. In 1900, there were 71,000 residents in Texas who said that they were of Mexican descent. That number skyrocketed over the next 30 years. By 1930, there are 684,000, about 10 times as many residents of Mexican descent in Texas. And of those almost 700,000 Mexican Americans, 38% were born in Mexico. Now, I already mentioned how the boom towns in West Texas and some in North Texas had led to illegal gambling, prostitution, and all kinds of saloons. And this often led, to lawlessness and violence, particularly when people drink a lot of alcohol. They, to this very day, do things that they wouldn't normally do if they were sober. And conservatives were looking for an answer, and they saw prohibition as a solution to the rampant disorder. So prohibition was not just to protect women being beaten by their husbands or attacked on the streets by drunks, but also to deal with this major, major problem in the oil field boom towns, which were growing up. And Texans already concerned about the general direction of the country. They said, well, people in Texas, including, whites too, are just blowing off prohibition. But my God, it's the law. And, why isn't the federal government doing more to enforce this law? So this increased the general unease of the Texans. Now let's look at the Ku Klux Klan, which I'm sure you've studied in other courses. And we mentioned briefly when we looked at Reconstruction. Well, the old Ku Klux Klan had gone away in the 1870s, late 1870s, because you'll recall Reconstruction had ended, and the Ku Klux Klan had been set up to intimidate blacks when the North controlled the South following the Civil War. But once the North left, with the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the racist whites were once again running the South. There was no need for the Ku Klux Klan. And so it just sort of faded away. However, the Ku Klux Klan came back with much more membership, starting in 1915 and lasted in the country through much of the 1920s. The impetus for the new Ku Klux Klan was a famous movie in 1915, The Birth of a Nation. It was a silent movie by the famous director D.W. Griffiths. It's a very long movie, about 3 hours. And it portrays the Ku Klux Klan as the savior of people being harassed by the freed slaves right after the Civil War. The setting of this movie is the original Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. Northern troops are running the South. The movie portrays the freed slaves, not all of them, but some of them, just running wild. And they're about to break into this, at the end of the movie, this cabin or this little house in which a white family is there. And, the audience thinks, oh my God, these blacks are going to come in and kill everyone, rape the women, etc. And the movie ends with the Ku Klux Klan on horses riding in and shooting the blacks outside, and all the whites inside hug the Ku Klux Klan. And when it was shown, white audiences would stand up and cheer the last 10 minutes. I've put a link to the video in Canvas. It's a very, very racist movie, but if you go in and just go to the last 10 minutes and watch that, and let's go back in our time machine, imagine you're watching this at the time, and, again, it's very, very racist. It portrays, the blacks as the villains. It was, by the way, the first movie ever shown in the White House. President Woodrow Wilson, who viewed himself as very much the progressive, showed it in the White House, and he nor his American dinner guests really saw nothing wrong with it. So that gives you an idea of white attitudes at the time. The movie was based on this book, The Klansman, by Thomas Dixon. This was a poster advertising the movie, and the birth of a nation, the nation referring to the Ku Klux Klan. This is the opening of the movie. So you'd have the Ku Klux Klan out openly parading around. And this announcement, I put a red arrow there. It said, "It will make a better American of you to see the Ku Klux Klan." And it was actually a hit throughout the United, not just the South, but this is an announcement from these are photos are from Portland, Oregon, in the extreme northwestern part of the United States. And the Ku Klux Klan was resurrected in Georgia, and there was a mountain still there called Stone Mountain. It's the largest solid stone in the world, and this is where they organized. Now, it's very important to understand that the new Ku Klux Klan was very different from the one after the Civil War. It was nationwide. In fact, most of the members didn't even live in the southern part of the United States. It extended throughout the country. There were members in New York, Oregon, California, and the focus was on being 100% American. Now, part of that was white supremacy. Part of it was nativism. They were against Southern Europeans. They were against Poles. So they expanded far beyond blacks, against blacks. I know they didn't like blacks, obviously. They were against blacks. They were in favor of white supremacy. But they were opposed to all immigrants who weren't from the sort of Anglo-Saxon countries of Germany, Scandinavia, Britain. They were against the teaching of Charles Darwin's theories in the school. They believed in a strict interpretation of the Bible. In other words, God created the earth and all things and animals on it in 7 days and 7 nights. They did not believe in Darwinism. They were against what was considered then modernity, certainly against flappers. They were against jazz music. They were very, very traditional. They opposed Catholics. Why Catholics? Well, this picks up on a long anti-Catholic sentiment, not just in the United States, but in the Protestant countries in Europe, that Catholics were not true patriots of the country they lived in, whether they lived in Britain or whether they lived in the United States. And why was that? Well, people would say the Catholics' primary loyalty is to the Pope in Rome, and it's not to the United States of America. They were against Jews, communists, socialists, certainly against atheists, against prostitutes, illegal liquor, and the list could go on and on. And the main point is the focus was no longer on blacks. I mean, they were certainly racist and believed in white supremacy, but most of the members lived in states where there were relatively few blacks. And I think you can understand the Ku Klux Klan best at this time period to view it more as a moral crusade that was often accompanied by violence against bootleggers. A bootlegger is someone who sells liquor during Prohibition, gamblers, husbands and wives who cheated on each other, men who beat their wives, child abuse, and anyone else they considered sinners. And they didn't go through the judicial system. If they heard a rumor that someone had beaten their wife, the Ku Klux Klan would go up, grab the man, And, they wouldn't kill them normally. They just give them a bad whipping. Same thing. Well, someone who was a child abuser, they might kill. And it was a vigilante group outside the legal system. And as I mentioned, the KKK was strongest at this time in areas where there were few or virtually no blacks. The rural Midwest, in farming areas, in Illinois, Indiana, there were virtually no blacks. That's where the Klan was strongest. In California and in Oregon. And in fact, the state of Oregon, because of the strong anti-Catholic sentiment of the Klan, actually banned and closed all Catholic schools in the state. And in 1928, the Democratic Party nominated New York Governor Al Smith as the Democratic candidate for the presidency. The Klan actively helped defeat Al Smith in that election because on the grounds that, one of the reasons was he was Catholic, and they said he was a papist taking orders from the Pope. Klan members also attacked him because he favored repeal of Prohibition. Now, the Klan was very open. This is Washington, D.C. here. This is one of many demonstrations where Klan members would go out and march in Washington, D.C. You notice their faces are visible. They're very proud and open about their Klan membership. Across the United States, there were 4 million members in the Klan in the 1920s. 6 governors were openly members of the Klan, and these included some governors from states like Ohio and Illinois. And 3 U.S. senators publicly announced that they were members of the Klan. Well, the Ku Klux Klan still exists, but its power and its influence and membership just crumbled when the Grand Dragon, who was like the chief of the Klan, he was convicted for kidnapping and rape of a woman. And, it showed that the Klan was very, very hypocritical. And we'll see in a few minutes how many white Protestant Texans moved against the Klan on the grounds that it was, setting up vigilante groups that resulted in too much violence. Now, let's look at Texas. The Klan in Texas was organized in Houston, and it was nicknamed across the state the Invisible Empire. And it spread rapidly across the state. And, there are many people who like being in something like this. Gives them a sense of being in an organization. The membership rose to more than 150,000 men. And the wives and daughters were also active, and they formed sort of auxiliary units. And the wives in particular often had bake sales to raise money. And then people would go to the bake sales to buy something. And the wives would say, "Oh, are you interested in the Klan?" And talk up membership in the Klan. I've always found it interesting that many, many white Protestant ministers openly supported the Klan because they thought it was an excellent way to promote morality. And Klan members also took a pledge when they joined the Klan to patronize or buy and sell from each other's businesses. In other words, let's help each other because we are members of the same organization. And they pressured elected officials at all levels, from the governor down to mayors, to endorse the Klan political priorities because of their large membership. Well, the net result is that many businessmen and politicians who didn't like the Klan, they disagreed with its ideology for one or many reasons, and they particularly didn't like the violence. Well, these businessmen and politicians would actually join the Klan because otherwise they'd lose so much business. However, studies have shown most of the active members of the Klan were poorly educated and from the lower middle classes. This is a photo of a Klan initiation ceremony. This is from 1922, and this is Richmond, Texas, which is just south of Katy here in West Texas. So that large Klan membership. On the other side of Houston, in Beaumont, this was a Klan parade in 1922, and as you can see, it's quite open. They are wearing their hoods. Most people knew who they were, but they were wearing their hoods because of the mystique of that. This is a student organization at what is now Rice University. They had a local Klan, like a club there, and the Rice University yearbook included photos of the club members, and you had some students, I think, in the chess club and others, and on the wrestling team or whatever. And this is the Ku Klux Klan. And this is, I think, an interesting. This was an invitation that was printed up and handed out to join a Ku Klux Klan rally at the State Fair of Texas in Dallas. And the public's invited. It says at the top, "Meet your friends, Ku Klux Klan Day at the State Fair." And I marked in red near the bottom, there'll be a reception, and they're going to decorate the members of the original Klansmen of the 60s. That's the 1860. So there'd be some elderly men there who had been in the original Ku Klux Klan in the 1860s, and they're going to get special awards. So this really appealed to people who wanted, a sense of belonging in this organization. That was very, very open, as you can see. Well, there was quite a bit of violence attributed to the Klan. They often got what they want without resorting to violence, just the threat of violence. And it turned out white Protestants themselves many of them turned against the Klan because of its terrorism and its stranglehold on Texas politics. Politicians were terrified of the business sector. And major newspapers came out, including the Houston Chronicle, and started writing strong articles against the Klan. The Klan protested. Klan members stopped buying the newspaper, but the Houston Chronicle still in publication and went on. And the Chamber of Commerce, the state of Texas, representing the business interests, came out against the Ku Klux Klan. And as a result, in the 20s, the leader of the Klan at the time, Hiram Evans, tried to moderate the Klan's methods. He really reduced the amount of violence from the Klan, and he thought the pressure would let up if the Klan could just get elected to office as conservative candidates within the Democratic Party. Well, the net result was much of the state government of Texas was controlled by the Klan. Just a note on the wet and dry counties in Texas. I know this is very confusing to many students, and particularly people outside of Texas. A wet county is a county that allows the sale of liquor. In a dry county, it's prohibited. So the basis of all this is the 1876 Constitution, which is still the Constitution of the state. It allows counties, towns, and cities, any sort of jurisdiction within the state, they have the authority to ban some or all alcoholic beverages in their geographic jurisdiction. So by 1908, before national prohibition, in Texas there were already 152 counties that were dry. There was no sale allowed of alcoholic beverages. Now, many of these counties had relatively few people, but still, it's a lot of counties. There were 66 partially dry counties. Now, partially dry is very complicated, and it can mean that in the county, it's legal to only buy, or sell rather. Some counties is just beer. which has up to 4% alcohol. Others say, well, beer and wine, alcoholic beverages up to 12%, but no hard liquor. This would be things like whiskey or, margarita drinks or, anything with a higher alcoholic content. Some partially dry counties, only part of the county is dry. That's the case, for instance, if you Harris County. I'll talk about in a minute. And then in 1908, 25 were completely wet counties. That meant essentially they could sell distilled alcohol like whiskey, gin, vodka, but whiskey was the big seller in addition to beer and wine. So let's zoom ahead to more or less the current day. This was the most recent and best map I could find. It's out of date, I know that, but it's 2011 counties. This is the clearest map I could find. You'll see the dry counties are in white, and those are in North Texas, the Panhandle, and then just south of that. Then way over in East Texas, there are a couple dry counties over by Louisiana. And then the wet are the green, and that's all alcoholic beverage sales are permitted. And you can see that's South Texas, Central Texas. And then the partially wet are the vast majority of the counties in 2011. And those are the brownish color. And you can see, for instance, Harris County is partially dry. Well, you may say, you didn't know that. Well, it's because this may have changed in the last few months, but as of last year, one place, Tomball, the city of Tomball, which is in Harris County, didn't allow restaurants in most of the city jurisdiction to sell hard liquor. And so that means the county is considered partially dry. So it's very, very complicated on this partially dry definition. Others now will allow you to buy everything, but you have to consume it on the premises. You can't go to a restaurant and get a pickup meal and then take a glass of whiskey with you or something like that. So as I mentioned, Harris County is partially dry. Okay, let's look at business progressivism and the Klan. Now, what do we mean by business progressivism? This means businessmen or businesses that emphasized economic development reforms, such as building better roads, better schooling, education, protection for women and children who worked in industry. And Governor Pat Neff in the early 1920s would fall in that category. However, Neff and other progressives, white progressives, wanted to restrict the political party primaries to whites only. And they had a state law and said it was whites only. And there were several variations of this. And in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you can't have the state saying that only whites can vote in a primary election. That violates the 14th Amendment, which allows, as you recall, equal protection for all Americans under the law. So the law can't say whites only. Well, Neff and the others got together, and, well, Neff wasn't governor then, but others got together, the whites in the Democratic Party, and came up with another formulation. So it wasn't the state government limiting participation. They said, it will just be the Democratic Party will not allow non-whites to participate in the primary election. And that went up to the Supreme Court, and lo and behold, the Supreme Court said, that's okay. That doesn't violate the Constitution, because the state itself, the government itself, is not limiting participation, but a private party is the Democratic Party. So the whites in the Democratic Party, which again, remember, was the racist party at the time, they all patted each other on the back and said, oh, aren't we clever? we were able to eliminate non-whites through our clever legal mechanism. And that continued for a long time. Now, the conservatives in the state legislature who favored many reforms that would help business, they obstructed the general progressive reforms that would have the effect of increasing regulations on their businesses in general, taxes, or state government spending. Now, Governor Neff refused to criticize the Klan, and it's not entirely clear whether he supported the Klan, or whether he didn't want to criticize them because of the political influence. But the net result was that left him open to charges that he supported the Klan. Well, that said, in 1922, he won the Democratic primary, and at this time in Texas history, whoever won the Democratic primary would win the general election. So Neff was elected again in 1922. Now, Neff was very progressive in the sense that he appointed many women to serve on the state board of regents at universities and colleges in the state. In fact, he established an all-woman lobbying council to pressure the legislature to improve reform of education and welfare. Now, critics came out and said, well, yes, women have the vote, but we shouldn't encourage them to participate so actively in politics. After serving 2 terms as governor, Neff decided he wasn't going to have a 3rd term. Well, this opened the door for Jim Ferguson. You'll recall he had been governor before, and he had been impeached and convicted by the Texas legislature for misappropriating and stealing money from the state. And at the same time, he had been banned from running for state political office. Well, he wanted to be governor again, but because of this prohibition, he couldn't run. So he convinced his wife to be the Democratic candidate for governor. Now, her name was Miriam Amanda Ferguson. Her initials, Miriam Amanda, M.A., spell Ma, so she called herself Ma Ferguson. And Ma was sort of the farmer's way of saying mom. And Ferguson, remember when he was governor, Jim Ferguson had appealed to the farmers, and so she and her husband had joint campaign speeches, and they appealed to the farmers as Ma. And then someone said, oh, is Jim going to be Pa? So they called themselves Ma and Pa, kind of a friendly way with the farmers to show they were just like the common folk. Well, anyway, both Ma Ferguson and Pa, her husband, went out and emphasized their support for the working Texans, particularly the farmers. She was very much handoff. In fact, in her first campaign speech, she said, quote, I don't know much about politics. Here's Jim to talk with you. So everyone knew voting for her would make her governor, but the real governor with the authority would be her husband. In fact, when asked about that, they said, well, you're actually going to get 2 governors for the price of 1. And his supporters said, that's funny. But she got elected. Now, both Ma and Pa Ferguson strongly opposed the Ku Klux Klan and progressive ideas in business. And part of her opposition to the Klan, she picked up in her slogan, a bonnet and not a hood. By that means she meant a Klan hood. So she'd say, let me wear a bonnet, which is the old, people don't use that. That was a woman's hat. It was called a bonnet. A bonnet and not a Klan hood. She won the primary election, and of course, at that time, winning the primary election in the Democratic Party meant that you would win the general election, which she did. And it's very interesting. She was the first female governor, not only in Texas, but in the entire country. Now here we have a photo of James, or Jim, who's Pa, and Miriam, the governor, Ma Ferguson. Well, throughout the country, the many opponents of the Ku Klux Klan at this time really celebrated Ferguson's victory. The New York Times, a liberal newspaper, and said, "This is great. We should have more governors speaking out against the Klan." And Jim Ferguson, the former governor, actually had an office next door to his wife's, and everybody knew that he was running the government, the state government, and Ma was just legally signing because as governor she had to legally sign. Their administration cut the budget and particularly focused on cutting public education and especially the University of Texas. On the positive side, in 1925, a law was passed by the legislature that prohibited the wearing of masks or disguises in public places. And this was passed at a time when Klan membership was already declining in Texas. And this really helped law enforcement crack down on Klan rallies. Now, the Fergusons, particularly Ma Ferguson, really felt that the courts were convicting too many poorer Texans than the rich Texans, and particularly those poor Texans who'd been arrested for drinking alcohol. And so she supported a very liberal pardon policy. The governor had the authority, and still does, to pardon certain criminals. And so she signed many pardons for convicted Texans. Now, these pardons, as well as attacking the educational system, and there was a general belief that there was corruption under the Fergusons. There was really no hard evidence, but it looked like if you wanted to get a deal with the state of Texas, you had to put a very expensive advertisement in Jim Ferguson's newspaper, and then you would get the deal. There was no hard evidence, but it certainly looked like that. So there were now a lot of allegations on corruption, about corruption. And so in the next gubernatorial election in 1926, in the Democratic primary, which in Texas is the same really as the election at this time, the Attorney General promised to end corruption, and he wanted to return to business progressive ideas. And lo and behold, he won the primary and then the general election. And Governor Moody served for 2 terms, and he really focused on promoting the business sector, a number of progressive reforms, which you can read about in the textbook, as well as open public auditing of the fiscal affairs, the accounts of the state. Because there were so many allegations about corruption, you needed to have public auditing of the accounts. Excuse me. Well, now the Klan is really on a decline. Governor Moody was strongly anti-Klan, and a new U.S. senator who had been elected who also strongly opposed the Klan. On a national level now, the Northern Democrats started pushing a very progressive agenda, which was too progressive for many conservatives in the Democratic Party in Texas. And this really opened the opportunity for Texas Republicans in 1928, in the national election, to look at the divided Democratic Party and try and get conservative Democrats to vote for the Republican candidate in the national election. Well, by coincidence, the 1928 Democratic Party's National Convention was held in Houston, the first time a major party had a national convention in Texas. But even though the convention was held in Texas, the New York Governor Al Smith was nominated and voted as the candidate for the Democrats. Now, Smith, in the election, lost in November to the Republican Herbert Hoover. And there are a number of reasons, two of which are the fact that Al Smith, as I mentioned before, was a Catholic, and the other was that Al Smith opposed Prohibition. So you have conservative Texas Democrats who don't like Catholics at all, and they are in favor of Prohibition, and there's no way they were going to vote for a Democratic candidate for the presidency who had such different views. So as a result, and I put this in red in the slide, a slim majority of Texans, it was 52%, voted for the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover. And this was the first time that Texans as a group had voted for a Republican presidential candidate. Now, this won't be repeated until 1952, when the majority of Texans vote for the Republican presidential candidate, Eisenhower. Well, that concludes this lecture, and in the next lecture, we'll look at the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II. Thank you.